I sat in my favorite chair by the window, holding my knitting and glancing outside from time to time. The October twilight was descending slowly on Bridgeville, painting the sky a soft pinkish gray. The house was quiet, with only the ticking of the antique clock in the living room and the creaking of a floorboard somewhere exposed to the fall dampness. At 72, I had learned to appreciate such moments of peace. The phone rang just as I was counting the loops. I waited grudgingly, but the call was short, and after the second ring, there was silence. Shrugging, I went back to knitting, but a few minutes later my phone beeped with a new message. Reluctantly, I put down my needles and went to the phone. The screen showed a number I didn't know, and a short message: "Don't eat anything your son brings today." I reread the text twice, then snorted. Some stupid joke or mistake. The message probably wasn't meant for me. Crespin was indeed gonna come by tonight. He'd called this morning and said something about wanting to discuss my business. Lately, he'd been making a lot of small talk about my age, about how I was having a hard time keeping up with the house, that it would make more sense to move to a place where I'd be looked after by professionals. I always answered him the same thing: that I was doing fine on my own, that my mind was clear and my hands were strong. Returning to the chair, I tried to concentrate on my knitting, but my thoughts were scattered. Crespin had always been a caring son, especially since his father's death 5 years ago. In recent months, though, his concern had become somewhat obsessive. He was always asking about my papers, insisting on accompanying me to doctor's appointments, even though I was perfectly capable of getting to the clinic on my own. Tabitha, his wife, began to drop by more often, always with some excuse. She would bring baked goods or ask me how I was feeling. She kept looking around the house as if she were assessing its value. Maybe I'm too suspicious, but lately I thought they were up to something. The anonymous message came to mind again. "Don't eat anything your son brings today." That's absurd. Crespin is my only child. I had him when I was 24. He grew up to be a kind boy, though somewhat selfish. He was average in school, then graduated from technical college, got a job as a safety inspector in a factory, married Tabitha when she was 35 and he was 38. A late marriage, but a successful one, it seemed. Their daughter Ivory is now in high school. Smart girl, but withdrawn. Lately, when they'd come over as a family, I'd noticed my granddaughter avoided looking me in the eye. Maybe it's puberty, or maybe there's something going on at home. I put away my knitting and went into the kitchen to put the kettle on. The house I've lived in for almost 50 years is familiar to me, down to the last crack in the wall. Here I was a young wife. Here I raised Crespin. Here I nursed my husband through his last months. Every room holds memories, and the thought of having to leave it all behind seems unbearable. Of course, the house is big for one person. 3 bedrooms upstairs, living room, dining room, and kitchen on the main floor, plus a basement and attic. The plot of land is not insignificant either, although I don't grow vegetables like I used to. But that doesn't mean I can't live here. I pay all the bills, keep the place tidy, go to the store, and cook my own meals. The kettle boiled, and I made myself some herbal tea. It was getting dark outside the window, and the street lights were on. Somewhere in the distance, I heard the sound of a car engine, probably one of the neighbors returning from work. Our neighborhood is quiet, family-oriented, middle-aged people with children or elderly couples. I sat down at the kitchen table and sipped my tea slowly, thinking about the strange message. Who could have sent it and why? I don't know many people I know. Most of my peers have either moved in with their kids or actually ended up in nursing homes. I maintain polite but not close relationships with my neighbors. Could this be someone's evil joke? But who would think of making a joke like that? And why today when Crespin is going to show up? The coincidence seems too strange. I remembered last week when Crespin brought me a pie from Tabitha, said she baked it especially for me, knows I like apple pie. The pie was delicious, but I felt sick afterward, dizzy and sleepy. I put it down to fatigue, to age. Now that memory had taken on an ominous tinge. No, that's nonsense. I've been reading too many detective stories, and I'm starting to see conspiracies everywhere. Crespin is my son. He won't hurt me. He's just concerned for my safety, wants me to be looked after in case anything happens. In the evenings, I often think of the past. Youth seems so far away, yet so vivid at the same time. My husband Harold was a good man, though not without his faults. He worked in the same factory where Crespin now works, but in a different shop. We met at a dance at the community center and married a year later. Harold wanted lots of children, but after Crespin was born, I had problems and no more children. Crespin grew up a quiet child, loved constructors and puzzles. As a teenager, he became a little withdrawn, but I thought that was normal. He had few friends, preferring to spend his time at home, reading technical magazines or tinkering with his radio. When he turned 16, Harold wanted to teach him to drive, but Crespin refused, saying he wasn't ready yet. He didn't get his license until he was 22. He met Tabitha at work. She was then a secretary in the personnel department. The girl seemed strange to me from the very first meeting. She smiled too much, too often said compliments that sounded insincere. But Crespin was in love, and I didn't interfere. I thought that in time I would get used to her and understand her better. Ivory was born 3 years after the wedding. I was happy to be a grandmother, dreaming of spending time with my granddaughter, teaching her to cook, telling her stories. But Tabitha restricted my contact with the child from the very beginning. There were always reasons why Ivory could not come to her grandmother. She had a cold, or she had important classes, or they were going somewhere. Now Ivory is 17 years old, and we hardly talk to each other. When the whole family comes to visit, the girl sits with the phone, answers one-word answers to my questions, and tries to leave as soon as possible. I blamed it on today's youth, their dependence on technology, but now I'm beginning to think it's not just that. Harold always said that I was too trusting, that I should observe people more, analyze their actions. He was a more practical man than I was, a better judge of people's character. I remember when he first met Tabitha, he said, "There's something wrong with her, Doreen. I can't quite put my finger on it, but I can feel it." I thought at the time that he was just jealous that Crespin was no longer ours alone. After Harold's death, I had a hard time, not only mentally, but practically. He always handled the finances, knew where everything was, how to pay the bills. At first, Crespin helped a lot. He explained to me how to use bank cards, how to pay for utilities online. I was grateful for his support, but then his help became too intrusive. He started insisting that I keep all my documents with him, supposedly for security. He said the house could be burglarized, that I could lose something. I agreed to give him copies, but I kept the originals. A few months ago, he brought some doctor, introduced him as an acquaintance, who agreed to examine me at home. The doctor asked strange questions about my memory, whether I remembered what I ate yesterday, what day of the week it was. I answered honestly, but I found some of the questions offensive. Why ask if I remembered my name? It's not like I'm crazy. Tabitha started acting differently too. She used to just be cold and formal, but now there's a patronizing note in her voice. She talks to me like I'm a child who needs to be explained to multiple times. When I resent her, she smiles softly and says, "We understand, Doreen, that things get harder as we get older." A car door slammed outside the window. I looked out and saw Crespin's familiar car. He was walking toward the house, carrying some kind of box. My heart raced, and the anonymous message came back to mind. No, I'm not going to think anything stupid. This is my son, the man I gave birth to and raised. Whatever problems may arise between us, he is incapable of hurting me. The doorbell rang at exactly 9:30 in the evening. I knew it was Crespin. He'd always been punctual, always thought tardiness was disrespectful. It was a trait he had inherited from his father, who had never been a minute late for work in all his 37 years at the plant. I opened the door and saw my son standing on the doorstep with a white cardboard box in his hands. Crespin looked as usual, neatly combed dark hair with graying clean shirt, dark pants. In his 48 years he was still trim, though he had grown fat in recent years. His job as an inspector didn't require physical exertion, and it was taking its toll on his figure. "Hi, Mom," he said as he entered the house and set the box on the hallway table. His voice sounded odd, too steady, as if he'd rehearsed those words on the way in. "How are you doing? How are you feeling?" "I'm fine," I replied, closing the door and examining his face. Something about his expression was alarming. Crespin was smiling, but the smile didn't touch his eyes. It was the kind of expression people have when they have to feign joy when they're not having any fun at all. "Tabitha made you a cake," he said, pointing to the box. "Remembers you like chocolate ones. Tried to make it especially for you, spent all day in the kitchen." I nodded, but something inside clenched. Tabitha had never baked a cake especially for me. In fact, as far as I could remember, she didn't really like to mess around in the kitchen, preferring to buy prepared foods at the store. And when they came to visit, they usually brought something bought from the pastry shop. "Come into the living room," I suggested. "Do you want tea?" Yes, of course. Crespin took the box and headed into the living room. I went into the kitchen to put the kettle on, but watched my son out of the corner of my eye. He sat down in the chair across from mine, set the box on the coffee table, and looked around the room as if he were seeing it for the first time. I returned with a tray containing cups, a sugar bowl, and a milkman, and settled into my chair. Crespin opened the box and I saw a really beautiful chocolate cake with frosting and some berries on top. It looked professional, not like home baking. "Beautiful cake," I said. "Where did Tabitha learn to bake like that?" "Ah, she's known how for a long time," Crespin answered quickly, pulling a plastic knife out of the box. "Just didn't have time before. Now I thought I'd treat you." He started cutting the cake, and I noticed his hands were shaking slightly. Crespin had never been a nervous man, always calm and reasonable. Seeing him in this state was unusual. "How are things at work?" I asked, pouring tea. "Fine." He put a piece of cake on a plate and held it out to me. "Same as usual. Checks, reports. Nothing special." I took the plate but didn't eat, continuing to watch my son. He cut off a piece for himself, but he didn't touch it either, just drank his tea in small sips. There was a strange silence in the room, broken only by the ticking of the clock. "How's Ivory?" I tried to make conversation. "How's school?" "Studying well." Crespin nodded, but his eyes ran around the room without stopping on me. "We'll be going to college next year. We're already choosing where to apply." "Maybe she could stop by Grandma's house sometime," I suggested. "It's been a while since we've had a proper chat." "She's really busy." Crespin brushed it off. "Preparing for exams, extra classes. Today's kids have a very different workload than we had." I looked at the plate in my hands again. The cake did look appetizing, but the anonymous message wouldn't leave my mind. "Don't eat anything your son brings today." Nonsense, of course, but something was keeping me from tasting the treat. "And you won't eat?" Crespin asked, nodding at my untouched plate. "You know, I've recently decided to limit myself a bit on sweets," I lied. "The doctor said that at my age, you have to watch your weight." Crespin frowned. "What doctor?" "We agreed I'd accompany you to all the doctors." "I didn't go to a doctor," I hastily corrected myself. "I just read an article in a magazine about healthy eating after 70. It advised eating less flour and sweets." "But it's a special cake," my son insisted. Tabitha worked so hard on it. She'd be upset if she knew you didn't even taste it. There was a strange note in his voice that I'd never heard before. He spoke as if something very important depended on my decision to try the cake. I looked at him carefully and saw that he was clenching his fists. "I'll try it another time," I said as calmly as I could. "I'll wrap a piece in foil, eat it tomorrow morning with coffee." "But it's better to eat it fresh," Crespin persisted. "It won't be so tasty by tomorrow. Come on, Mom, at least a little piece, for Tabitha's sake." Now I was sure something was wrong. Crespin had never been so insistent about little things like this. Usually if I refused some treat, he just shrugged and forgot about it. Now, however, he was clearly worried about my refusal. "You know I really don't want one," I said firmly. "Apologize to Tabitha on my behalf. Tell her I really appreciate her concern, but I can't tonight." Crespin leaned back in his chair and ran his hand through his hair. An expression appeared on his face that I couldn't understand. He seemed to be struggling with some internal contradiction. "Okay," he finally said, "suit yourself. But then let's talk about something else, about your plans." "What plans?" "Well, about the future, about how you see your life going forward." He leaned forward, interlocking his fingers. "Mom, I think it's time we had a serious discussion about you moving out." This is it, I thought. This is what he'd come for. It wasn't the cake that was the main purpose of the visit, but this conversation. The cake was just an excuse, a way to get me comfortable with him. "We've already discussed this," I said. "I don't want to move anywhere. I'm fine in my house." "But think practically," Crespin spoke faster, more convincingly. "The house is big. It's hard for you to clean it. What if something happens? If you fall or get sick, who's going to help you? I have a phone. The neighbors are close by." "The neighbors might not hear, and the phone might run out of power, or you might not be able to reach it." He spoke as if he'd already envisioned such scenarios in great detail. In a nursing home, there's always medical staff, 24-hour supervision. "I'm not going to a nursing home," I said sharply, "and I don't understand why you're bringing it up again." "Because I'm worried about you." Crespin's voice rose. "Because I'm your son, and I'm responsible for your safety." It wasn't true, and we both knew it. Children were not legally responsible for their adult parents unless they were declared incapacitated. But there was something else in his words, something that made me even more wary. "I'm an adult," I said slowly, "a capable and healthy one. No one can force me to move somewhere against my will." Crespin fell silent and stared into his cup. Red spots appeared on his cheeks, a sure sign that he was angry or nervous. As a kid, his cheeks always got so red when he got into an embarrassing situation. "Of course, no one can force it," he finally said. "It's about making a sensible decision, about anticipating possible problems in advance, rather than waiting for something to happen." "What exactly is supposed to happen?" I asked. "You make it sound like you know something I don't." He raised his head sharply and looked at me. Something flashed in his eyes that could be mistaken for consternation. "I don't know anything," he said quickly. "Just thinking ahead. At our age, you have to be realistic." At our age. He's 48, I'm 72. 24 years difference, but he says at our age, like we're the same age, or as if he already considers himself an old man. Crespin finished his tea and set the cup on the table. "Okay, let's not talk about it yet, but promise me you'll think about it, okay?" "I'll think about it," I agreed, even though there was nothing to think about. My decision hadn't changed and wouldn't change. He got up from his chair and started picking up the box of cake. "I'll leave this for you," he said. "Maybe tomorrow you'll change your mind about the diet." I walked him to the door, watching him put on his jacket. His movements were kind of abrupt, nervous. Usually Crespin moved in a smooth, measured way. "Say hi to Tabitha," I said, "and thanks for the cake." "I will." He pecked me on the cheek, as he always did when saying goodbye. "Take care, Mom." I closed the door behind him and leaned my back against it. My heart was pounding like I'd run a marathon. The whole conversation seemed somehow wrong, artificial to me. Crespin wasn't acting like his usual self, and that scared me more than I was willing to admit. I went back into the living room and sat down in my chair, but calm didn't come. The white box of cake stood on the coffee table, and I couldn't take my eyes off of it. The anonymous message was spinning around in my head like a broken record. "Don't eat anything your son brings today." The coincidence seemed too strange. I stood up and cautiously approached the table. The cake looked innocent, dark chocolate frosting, raspberries neatly arranged on top, evenly sliced pieces. One piece was missing, the one Crespin had placed on my plate. I leaned closer and scrutinized the slice. There was something glistening in the thickness of the cake, between the layers of sponge and cream. At first, I thought it was just moisture from the cream, but looking closer, I realized it was something else. Small crystals, almost imperceptible, scattered unevenly throughout the mass. I went to the kitchen to get a magnifying glass, a habit my husband had left behind to look at small details. Harold liked to fix clocks and watches, and he had a collection of magnifying glasses. Back in the living room, I turned on the table lamp and studied the cake under magnification. What I saw made my heart beat faster. There were indeed small white crystals scattered in the cream, clearly not sugar or salt. They looked like a pharmaceutical drug ground into a powder. Someone had put something in the cake on purpose, and not very carefully, the crystals were unevenly distributed. I set the magnifying glass aside and sank into the chair. My hands were shaking and my mouth was dry. So the anonymous message was true. Someone really was trying to warn me that Crespin was bringing something dangerous. But why? Why would my own son put some kind of medicine in my food? And what could it be? Sleeping pills? Something more serious? I tried to remember if this had happened before. That apple pie last week that made me sick. I'd written it off as fatigue, but now it seemed suspicious. And even earlier, about 3 months ago, Tabitha had brought homemade cookies. I'd eaten a few, and then I'd felt weird all day, like everything was happening in a fog. The more I remembered, the more details came to mind. Crespin began to inquire too often about my well-being, always asking if I was forgetting things, if I was mixing up dates. And that doctor he'd brought in a month ago, Dr. Harlow, I think that was his name, he asked very specific questions about my memory, about my ability to navigate space and time. Now it was all coming together in an unpleasant way. They were trying to convince the people around me that I had a problem with my head, and for this they needed proof. Cases of forgetfulness, confusion, inadequate behavior. I got up and walked around the room, trying to calm down and think soberly. Maybe I was putting too much on myself? Maybe those crystals in the cake were just badly dissolved sugar or some special flavor additive. But then why was Crespin so insistent that I try the cake? Why did he look so nervous and upset when I refused? A healthy person would have just shrugged and forgotten about it. I remembered another episode. 2 weeks ago, Crespin walked in on me with some papers, saying they were insurance papers I needed to sign to renew my policy. I started to read them, but he rushed me, saying that he didn't have much time, that I could sign them without reading them, that there was nothing important in them. Then I insisted on reading the documents carefully. It turned out that it wasn't insurance at all, but some kind of power of attorney to manage my financial affairs. When I asked about it, Crespin was embarrassed and said that he had mixed up the papers and had taken the wrong documents. And even earlier, he had suggested that I make him a co-owner of the house. supposedly so that in case of my death, there would be no problems with the inheritance. He said that it was a common practice, that all elderly people did that. I refused, said that the will is already written, and I'm not going to change anything. Now, all these disparate episodes were beginning to form a system. Crespin and Tabitha were clearly planning something, and that plan involved my legal capacity and my estate. But how far were they willing to go? That powder in the cake, what was it? What would happen if I ate that piece? I went to my bedroom and pulled out a notebook from my nightstand where I jotted down important phone numbers and addresses. Among them was the number of Dr. Freeman, my primary care physician for over 15 years. He knew my medical condition well and could tell me what drugs might have been added to my food and what it would lead to. But calling him in the middle of the night was stupid. Besides, what would I say? That I suspected my son of trying to poison me? It sounded paranoid. Instead, I decided to preserve the evidence. I carefully wrapped one piece of cake in cling wrap and put it in the freezer. I could have it analyzed by a lab if I needed it. I threw the rest of the cake in the trash, but then I changed my mind and pulled it back out. If Crespin asks about the cake tomorrow, it would be weird to explain why I threw it away without tasting it. Better to say I ate it and thank him for the treat. I sat in the kitchen and tried to remember all the suspicious moments over the past few months. There were more than I realized. Crespin had dropped by unannounced too often, ostensibly just to check on me. But each time he scrutinized the house, looking in different rooms, wondering where I kept my papers. Tabitha was different, too. She used to be just cold and distant, but now there was something predatory in her demeanor. She asked too many questions about my habits, how I spent my days, what I bought, who I socialized with. They also started limiting my interaction with my granddaughter. Ivory used to at least say hello to me, answer simple questions. Now she avoids even looking in my direction. Perhaps she'd been told that Grandma had a problem with her head, that it was better not to talk to me. I remembered the look on Ivory's face during the family's last visit. She looked unhappy, fidgeting with the sleeve of her sweater and looking at her parents as if she were afraid to say the wrong thing. And when I suggested she take home a book she might like, Tabitha quickly intervened and said Ivory didn't have time to read. All her time was spent studying. Maybe it was Ivory who sent the anonymous message. Who else could have known about Crespin and Tabitha's plans? A 17-year-old girl could have overheard her parents talking and decided to warn her grandmother. But then the situation is even more serious than I thought. If even a child realizes that something bad is going on, it means that their plans are really sinister. I tried to imagine what would happen if I ate that cake. Most likely, I'd be sick, dizzy, confused. Crespin, of course, would have called a doctor, or better yet, an ambulance. And everyone would have seen an elderly woman in an inadequate state. And then there would have been tests, examinations, conclusions, and maybe a recommendation to put me in foster care or an institution. After all, I can't cope with self-care. I have memory problems. I can harm myself or others. The more I thought about it, the more real this scenario seemed. And the more I realized I was in grave danger. I had to act, but carefully. If I blamed Crespin and Tabitha directly, they might say I was paranoid, that I was making up threats that didn't exist. That would only strengthen their position. We need proof, hard, irrefutable proof that they're plotting something against me. A piece of cake in the freezer is a good start, but it's not enough. I need more. I decided to start writing down all suspicious incidents with exact dates and details, and to closely observe my son and daughter-in-law's behavior. If they are really planning something, sooner or later they will give themselves away. The clock on the fireplace struck midnight. I was tired, but I didn't want to sleep. There were too many thoughts running through my head, too many fears and suspicions. Life, which had seemed calm and predictable in the morning, was suddenly a minefield. I woke up early, though I didn't fall asleep until the morning. The sun was barely above the horizon, and I was already sitting on my bed, fully awake and clear-headed. The events of last night didn't seem like a nightmare now. On the contrary, they looked even more disturbing in the daylight. The first thing I did was check the freezer. The foil-wrapped piece of cake lay where I'd left it. It wasn't a hallucination, not a figment of a sick fantasy. The cake existed, and there was something suspicious about it. I made myself some coffee and sat down at the kitchen table with a notebook and a pen. I needed to systematically analyze all the oddities of the last few months, to put them in order, to see if there was any logic in them. I started with the documents. About 6 months ago, I noticed that some papers from my home archive had disappeared. First, a folder of insurance policies disappeared. I looked for it everywhere, but I couldn't find it. Crespin said he would help me recover the documents, and indeed, he brought new copies a week later. Then the deposit account agreement with the bank went missing. I kept all the bank documents in a separate folder in my desk, checking them regularly. But one day the folder was empty. When I asked Crespin, he suggested that I might have moved the documents elsewhere and forgotten about it. "That's normal at your age, Mom," he said at the time. "Memory isn't the same anymore. Let me help you put your papers in order so nothing else gets lost." I agreed then, and we spent an entire evening going through my papers. Crespin made copies of all the important documents, saying he would keep them with him for safekeeping. We put the originals in a new folder he'd bought especially for this purpose. Now I realized that it wasn't help, but intelligence. Crespin studied all my documents, found out about the size of my savings, my insurance policies, my will, and then began gradually taking copies under the pretext of security. The next item on my list was doctor's appointments. Over the past 4 months, Crespin and Tabitha insisted on accompanying me to 3 different specialists. Each time they said they were concerned about my health, that regular checkups were needed at my age. The first was a cardiologist, Dr. Stevenson. I didn't complain about my heart, but Crespin said a preventive checkup wouldn't hurt. The doctor conducted an examination, did a cardiogram, took tests. The results were good. My heart was working fine for my age. But something strange happened during the examination. Tabitha kept asking the doctor questions about my mental state. Did he notice any signs of dementia? Did he think I looked confused? And Crespin added that at home, I sometimes forgot to turn off the stove or lost my keys. That wasn't true. I never forgot to turn off the stove or lost my keys, but Dr. Stevenson wrote down everything they said in my medical records. A month later, they took me to a neurologist, Dr. McIntosh. This time the excuse was my complaints of headaches, which I didn't really have. Crespin told the doctor that I often complained of pain in my temples, that it prevented me from sleeping. Dr. McIntosh ran some memory and attention tests. I completed them with no problem, but Tabitha intervened again, claiming that I was behaving differently at home. Allegedly, I sometimes don't recognize people I know, get my names mixed up, forget what day it is. I tried to object, but the doctor trusted my caring relatives more than I did. In his eyes, they looked like worried children who were genuinely concerned about their elderly mother. And I looked like a typical elderly patient who doesn't want to admit her problems. The third visit was to a psychiatrist, Dr. Harlow. Crespin introduced him as an acquaintance who agreed to see me at home so I wouldn't have to go to the clinic. I thought at the time that my son was showing concern, not wanting me to tire myself out. Dr. Harlow turned out to be an unpleasant man with cold eyes. He asked strange questions. Could I remember what I had for breakfast yesterday? Could I name all the presidents of the country in reverse order? Did I know what day of the week it was? Some of the questions were so absurd that I questioned his competence. And then he started asking about my fears and worries. Do I feel like someone is watching me? Do I hear voices? Do I think my relatives are plotting something bad against me? I honestly answered that I didn't experience anything like that, but now I realize those questions were not random. Dr. Harlow was setting the stage for future accusations of paranoia. After every doctor's visit, Crespin made sure to get copies of all the reports. He said he needed it for the family archives, so he'd have all my health records in case of an emergency. Now I wrote down in my notebook the dates of all the visits and the names of the doctors. The picture was becoming clearer. Crespin and Tabitha were systematically creating a medical history that would confirm my inability to live independently. The next point of my analysis was financial. A month ago, Crespin had suggested that I execute a power of attorney for him to manage my bank accounts. He said it would make it easier to pay bills and handle other financial matters. "It's not like you don't know about modern banking technology, Mom," he said. "And if something happens to you, how will I be able to pay your bills? Power of attorney is just a precaution." I refused, saying I was doing fine financially on my own. But Crespin wouldn't back down. He cited examples of people he knew whose elderly parents had been hospitalized and whose bills had gone unpaid. He talked about how important it was to prepare in advance for potential problems. He also kept asking me about my spending. Why did I buy a new washing machine? Did it cost too much to repair the roof? Maybe I should have consulted him before making such major purchases. It annoyed me, but I chalked it up to overprotectiveness. I thought Crespin was just worried about me falling prey to scammers. Now I realized he'd been looking into my finances and planned to access them. I got up from the table and walked around the kitchen, pondering the information I'd gathered. The facts were adding up to a disturbing picture, but it was still possible to interpret them in different ways. Maybe Crespin really does care about my future. Maybe he sees problems that I don't. But the cake with the strange crystals shattered all pious explanations. No amount of caring could justify putting some sort of substance in the food. I went back to my notebook and continued my notes. The next topic was Ivory's behavioral changes. My granddaughter had always been a quiet girl, but in recent months, she had become even more withdrawn. When the whole family came to visit, Ivory avoided being alone with me. If they did, she looked tense and tried to leave as soon as possible. On their last visit 3 weeks ago, a strange episode occurred. Tabitha and Crespin were talking in the living room, and I went into the kitchen to get some cookies. Ivory followed me, and I rejoiced at the opportunity to talk to my granddaughter. But instead of the usual conversation, the girl came up to me and said quietly, almost in a whisper, "Grandma, be careful." And then, hearing her parents' footsteps, she quickly went to the window and began to look at something in the street. At that time, I didn't pay much attention to it. I thought she was talking about general safety measures. Don't open the door to strangers. Don't walk alone in the dark. But now these words took on a completely different meaning. I also remembered how Ivory had acted during that psychiatrist's visit. Dr. Harlow was asking me his questions. Crespin and Tabitha were adding their own, and her granddaughter was sitting in the corner of the living room, watching. The look on her face was, how shall I describe it? Embarrassed or guilty. Maybe Ivory was the one who sent me that anonymous message. She has a cell phone. She knows how to use modern technology. And she's the only one in the family who could have tried to warn me. I wrote that observation down in my notebook, too. The list grew longer and the picture became clearer and more frighteningly consistent. The next item was a change in the behavior of Crespin and Tabitha themselves. They began to visit me more often, but those visits changed in character. My son used to come by just to talk, to see how things were going, sometimes to help with minor repairs. Now, every visit had a specific purpose. He'd bring documents to sign. He'd ask me to go to the doctor. He'd ask about my future plans. He'd talk about the safety of the elderly and the need for professional care. And Tabitha, who used to have little contact with me, suddenly took an active interest in my life. She asked me about my neighbors, who visits me, who I talk to on the phone. She was interested in my shopping, my habits, my daily routine. At first, it seemed like an attempt at a relationship. I was even glad that my daughter-in-law finally started to treat me like a family member. Now I realize it was a reconnaissance. I got up and went to the window. It was an ordinary fall day outside. Gray skies, bare trees, sparse passers-by. My quiet neighborhood looked peaceful and safe, but I no longer felt safe in my own home. Returning to my desk, I continued my notes. I needed to record everything, even the smallest details that might seem insignificant. For example, Crespin had started checking the locks on my doors too often. He said he was worried about security, that there was an increase in burglaries in the neighborhood, but I hadn't heard about any thefts from neighbors or the news. He also insisted that I give him spare keys to the house. In case of an emergency, he explained. I agreed, but now I regret it. Who knows if he'd use them in my absence? Tabitha, too, showed a strange interest in the technical details of my life. She asked how the alarm system worked, if I had a panic button, if I knew the emergency numbers by heart. Seemingly caring questions, but asked a little too insistently. And there was one more thing that now seemed suspicious. About 2 months ago, Crespin had suggested installing surveillance cameras in my house, said it was a modern way to keep the elderly safe. That many people were doing it. I refused, saying I didn't want to live under constant surveillance. But Crespin kept insisting, citing statistics on crimes against the elderly, telling me how cameras had helped find criminals in other cases, and then he changed tactics. He began to say that cameras are not for protection against thieves, but for medical safety. If something happened to me, my family would be able to find out sooner and help me. Now I understood the true purpose of this suggestion. The cameras would allow them to watch me at all times, to record any of my actions that could be interpreted as signs of inadequacy. I set the pen aside and rubbed my temples. My head ached from the tension and from realizing the magnitude of the situation. My own son, the man I'd given birth to and raised, was planning to deprive me of my freedom, and he had done it not in a fit of anger or under the influence of the moment, but systematically, deliberately. But why? Is the house and my savings so important to him? Or are there some other reasons that I don't know about? I tried to remember if Crespin had any financial problems. He never complained about money, worked steadily, lived in his own house. Tabitha worked too. They had a car. They could afford vacations. But maybe outward prosperity was deceptive? Maybe they had accumulated debts that I don't know about? Or did they want to secure Ivory's future, to pay for her university studies? Motives weren't the main thing right now, though. What was important was figuring out exactly what they were planning and how to counter it. I glanced at my watch. It was almost noon. It was going to be a long and difficult day, but I had to make the most of it. I needed to gather more information to find ways to protect myself. After lunch, I decided to thoroughly check all my paperwork. If Crespin and Tabitha were really planning something, traces of their activities had to remain somewhere in my papers. I went up to my bedroom and opened the desk where I kept my most important documents. The folder of insurance policies that Crespin had helped me recover was lying in its place. I pulled it out and began to scrutinize the contents. At first glance, everything looked normal, the same policies I'd had before, with the same numbers and coverage amounts. But when I looked more closely, I found something strange. The date on one of the policies had been corrected. Someone had carefully changed the year from 2018 to 2023. The correction had been made so subtly that it could only be noticed by close examination. And the medical policy had added a line for psychiatric coverage that hadn't been there before. I remembered this for sure because when I had taken out the policy 5 years ago, I had specifically asked what kinds of treatment it covered. Next, I checked the bank documents. The deposit account agreement looked suspiciously new for a document that was several years old. The paper was too white, the text too crisp. I compared it to other bank documents. The difference was obvious. Moreover, there was a clause in the contract about the possibility of third-party management of the account in case of the owner's incapacity. This clause was definitely not in the original agreement. I kept going through the folders, and with each find, my indignation grew. Someone was systematically forging my documents, preparing the ground for some future action, and that someone could only be Crespin. He had copies of all the documents, access to my house, and the ability to discreetly replace the originals with forgeries. In the very depths of a desk drawer, I found a folder I didn't remember. A plain gray folder with no signatures, stuffed between old tax returns. I opened it and was stunned. Inside were drafts of some kind of medical reports, handwritten notes in Tabitha's familiar handwriting. She wrote down the symptoms she supposedly observed in me: forgetfulness, confusion, aggressiveness when trying to help, refusal of medical attention. Next came a list of doctors with their contact information and fees. Dr. Harlow, the same psychiatrist who came to my house, received $1,000 for his visit. Next to his name was a notation, willing to give an opinion on dementia for an additional fee. My hands shook as I turned the pages. The next document was even worse, a draft of a petition to declare me incompetent. Crespin described my allegedly deteriorating condition, my inability to make rational decisions, the danger I posed to myself and others. As evidence, he cited eyewitness testimony, neighbors who had allegedly seen me leave the house in inappropriate clothing or leave the front door unlocked. All these were fabrications, but they sounded plausible. And then there was a point-by-point plan of action. First, get me declared incompetent, then get a guardianship, and finally, sell the house and move me to a cheaper nursing home, and keep the difference in money. In the folder were the documents for the sale of the house, a contract of sale with Crespin as my guardian as the seller. The buyer was some real estate firm. The amount was well below the actual value of the house. I also found a list of nursing homes with prices and conditions. Crespin chose the cheapest option, a municipal facility in a neighboring town where the elderly were actually warehoused in overcrowded wards. At the end of the folder was a printout from a travel company's website, a Caribbean cruise worth $25,000. The dates of the trip were right around the time the plan was to finalize the sale of the house. I closed the folder and leaned back in my chair. The scale of the betrayal exceeded my worst suspicions. My own son didn't just want to get rid of me, he planned to steal my entire life, my possessions, my freedom. And none of this was a spontaneous decision. According to the dates on the documents, they'd been planning this for over a year, systematically, methodically preparing the ground for their actions, bribing doctors, forging documents, creating false evidence of my inadequacy. I stood up and paced the room, trying to control my emotions, anger, hurt, frustration, all mixed up in a ball. How could my own child have planned this? How could I have been so wrong about the man I'd raised since birth? But now was not the time for self-abuse. I had to act. I had irrefutable proof of their plans. All that remained was to decide what to do with it. I went back to my desk and started taking pictures of the documents on my phone. Technology wasn't my strong suit, but in recent years I'd learned how to use a camera and email photos. I photographed each page several times to be sure of the quality of the image. I was especially careful to take pictures of signatures and stamps. They were the main clues to forgery. When I was done photographing, I hid the original folder somewhere else, in a box of winter clothes in my closet. If Crespin discovered the documents missing from the desk, he might try to destroy them. The next step was to find a reliable attorney. I needed a family law specialist who could help protect my interests. I pulled out the phone book and started looking at the ads for law firms. Most of the attorneys specialized in divorce, car accidents, or criminal cases. Finally, I found an ad for Adams and Associates, a law firm that listed elder law defense and domestic abuse cases among its specialties. I dialed the number, and a woman with a pleasant voice answered the phone. "Good afternoon. This is the law firm of Adams and Associates. My name is Carolyn. How can I help you?" "Hello," I said, trying to speak as calmly as possible. "My name is Doreen Claypool. I'm in need of counseling regarding defense against the actions of a relative." "Of course, Mrs. Claypool. Can you briefly explain the nature of the problem?" I told her the basic facts. My son's attempts to have me incapacitated, the forged documents, the plans to sell my house. Caroline listened attentively, occasionally asking clarifying questions. "This is a serious situation," she said when I finished. "We have experience with cases like this. Could you come to our office today? Attorney Adams will be able to see you at 4 o'clock this afternoon." "Yes, of course," I agreed. "Is there somewhere else we can meet? I don't want my son to know I've seen a lawyer." "I see. Mr. Adams can meet you at the Bluebird Cafe on Main Street. It's a safe and crowded place." We made the appointment, and I hung up the phone. It was still 2 hours away from 4 o'clock, but I was already feeling relieved. I finally had hope for a defense. I went back to studying the documents in the secret folder. The more carefully I read them, the more details came to light. Crespin and Tabitha had thought of everything. They'd even drawn up a schedule of my allegedly inappropriate behaviors to convince the court of the need for custody. According to this schedule, I was supposed to forget to pay my utility bills next month, and another month later to get lost during a walk and be found by neighbors in a confused state. As I read these plans, I realized that they weren't going to wait for my condition to naturally deteriorate. They planned to create situations that looked like manifestations of dementia. The folder even had instructions on how to administer various medications: sleeping pills to give the impression of confusion, mild tranquilizers to simulate apathy, and more serious drugs for cases where hospitalization was necessary. Now I knew what was in that cake. Probably some kind of sleeping pill that was supposed to make me drowsy and disoriented. Crespin was counting on me eating the cake, getting sick, and calling a doctor, and the doctor would document my inadequate state. I looked at my watch. I had an hour and a half before my meeting with the lawyer. I had to prepare carefully for the conversation, think over all the questions I wanted to ask. The main thing was to find out what legal options I had for defense. Can Crespin be prosecuted for document forgery? How do I prevent them from filing a declaration of incapacity? What if they try to force me to sign some papers? I made a list of questions and put it in my purse along with my phone, where I kept photos of the compromising documents. The evidence was compelling. I just had to find a way to use it. Outside the window, the sun was slanting toward the west, casting the room in a golden glow. In a few hours, my life could change dramatically. But I was ready to fight for my freedom and dignity. I had lived too many years, experienced too much to let anyone steal my independence. The Bluebird Cafe was located in the center of town, in an old building with tall windows and wooden tables. I arrived a little early for my appointment and chose a table by the window, where I had a good view of the street. Nervousness never left me, but my resolve was firm. Lawyer Adams turned out to be a man in his 50s, with graying temples and attentive brown eyes. He was dressed in a dark suit, but without a tie, giving him a more approachable appearance. When he introduced himself and shook my hand, I felt the confidence of a professional in his shake. "Mrs. Claypool," he said, sitting down across from me, "Caroline has given me the general details of your situation. This is a serious matter indeed. Tell me everything from the beginning." I pulled out my phone and showed him the pictures of the documents I'd found in the secret folder. The lawyer scrutinized each image, occasionally zooming in on the details on the screen. His face grew increasingly grim. "This is a classic case of financial abuse of an elderly person," he said finally. "Unfortunately, schemes like this are becoming more and more common. Relatives use age as an excuse to gain control of an estate." He explained to me the legal aspects of the situation. Document forgery was a criminal offense. Bribing doctors to get false reports also fell under fraud, and the plan to force hospitalization and sell the property without the owner's consent constituted a serious violation of my civil rights. "What are our options?" I asked. "Several," Adams replied. "The first is to file a fraud report with the police. The second is to file a civil suit to protect property rights. The third is to get an injunction against any action by your son against your papers and property." "And which option is the most effective?" "A combination approach," the attorney said. "But there's one problem. All of our evidence is based on documents you found in your home. Your son could claim you forged them yourself in a state of paranoia, or that they're just drafts with no legal standing." I felt my heart clench. "So, this evidence isn't enough?" "They're important, but we need more. We need witnesses, tapes of conversations, documentation of their actions." Adams leaned forward. "And most importantly, we need to catch them red-handed." "What do you mean?" "We need to create a situation where they try to carry out their plan and we record it. For example, if they try to force you to sign transfer of authority papers or consent to hospitalization." Adams pulled out a notepad and began to sketch out a plan. The idea was simple, but risky. I was to act normal without showing that I knew of their plans. And when they made their next move, we'd have witnesses and recording devices ready. "It's dangerous," the lawyer warned. "If they realize you've exposed them, they may try to speed things up, force you to sign documents, or even use physical force." "What if I just refuse to see them? Change the locks, don't open the door?" "It's a temporary measure. They have copies of your paperwork, doctor's contacts. They can file a petition for your incapacity, citing paranoia and refusal of help from relatives. And then the court can order a forced medical examination." We discussed the details of the plan. Adams suggested installing hidden cameras and microphones in my house. The next time Crespin and Tabitha came over, all their words and actions would be recorded, and there would be witnesses in the next room, the lawyer himself and the private investigator he was working with. "But how do we get them to come and show their true intentions?" I asked. "We'll create an excuse," Adams replied. "You'll call your son and tell him you're not feeling well and that you're willing to discuss moving into a nursing home. They'll take that as a victory and rush to build on the success." The plan seemed reasonable, but I felt afraid. I'd have to play the part, pretend to be weak and submissive as the anger boiled up inside. But there was no other way to get hard evidence. We agreed to meet tomorrow morning at my house to set up the equipment. Adams gave me his business card and emergency phone number. "If you feel really threatened, call 911 right away," he said in parting. And then me. "Don't try to go it alone." I got home as the sun was already setting. The house greeted me with its usual silence, but now that silence seemed ominous. Tomorrow, events would take place here that would determine my fate. In the evening, I carefully planned my behavior. I had to think over every word, every phrase I would say to Crespin on the phone. It was important to sound convincing, but not to overdo the acting. I decided to plead night sickness. I'll say I woke up in the middle of the night with chest pains and realized I couldn't do it alone, that I was afraid of another attack and was willing to consider the options Crespin suggested. The role of the submissive old lady was hard for me. All my life I was independent, made my own decisions, did not need someone's tutelage. But now the future depended on my acting. The next morning, at 8 o'clock sharp, An inconspicuous gray van pulled up to my house. Lawyer Adams got out of it, along with a thin man in his 40s in work clothes. He was Gerald Cope, a private investigator and surveillance equipment installer. They worked quickly and professionally. Microphones were hidden in bookcases and under desks. Miniature cameras were camouflaged among photo frames and decorative objects. All the equipment was wireless and transmitted the signal to a laptop they had set up in the basement. The recording quality will be excellent, Cope assured me, and best of all, it can all be used as evidence in court. When the technical preparations were complete, we rehearsed the plan one more time. I was to call Crespin around noon and ask him to come over for an important conversation. Adams and Cope would be in the basement where they could hear and see everything through the monitors. Remember, the lawyer said, your job is to get them to talk openly about their plans. Make them think you've given up, that you're willing to sign whatever documents you want, but don't sign anything until we intervene. At 12:30, I dialed Crespin's number. My heart was beating so loud I felt like I could hear it through the phone. Crespin? I said in a trembling voice. It's Mom. Can you come over? I need to talk to you. What's wrong? There was wariness in his voice. I was sick at night, really bad. And I realized, maybe you're right. Maybe I do need help. The pause in the tube dragged on. I could almost hear Crespin mulling over my words. Of course, Mom, he finally said, and there was a note of barely restrained triumph in his voice. I'm on my way right now, and I'll grab Tabitha, okay? She'll help us talk things over. Okay, I agreed. Just get here as soon as you can. I'm afraid to be alone. After I hung up, the lawyer nodded approvingly. Good, they've believed it. Now, the hard part is waiting and not giving yourself away when they come. The next hour dragged on for an excruciatingly long time. I tried to do the usual chores, washing the dishes, watering the flowers, but my hands shook with tension. Every sound on the street made me flinch. Finally, Crespin's familiar car appeared in the window. Adams and Cope went down to the basement, and I took a deep breath and prepared myself for the most important role of my life. My future depended on how convincingly I played the helpless old lady. Crespin and Tabitha walked toward the house at a brisk pace. Tense anticipation was written on their faces. They thought they had finally gotten their way, that I had surrendered and was ready to bend to their will. I opened the door, a look of exhaustion and confusion on my face. The game was on. Mom, how are you feeling? Crespin entered the house first, followed by Tabitha with a large bag in her hands. Both looked worried, but I noticed an ill-concealed excitement in their eyes. Bad, I replied in a weak voice, leaning on the door jamb. Really bad. I was up all night, my heart was aching, and in the morning I realized I couldn't live like this anymore. Crespin put his arm around my shoulders and led me into the living room. His touch seemed caring, but I could sense in him the tension of a predator who'd finally cornered his prey. Sit down, Mom, he said softly. Tell us everything in detail. I sank into my chair and painted a look of confusion on my face. I'm afraid, Crespin. Afraid that something will happen to me and no one will be around. Maybe you're right. Maybe I do need supervision. Tabitha sat down on the couch across from me and opened her bag. Doreen, we're so glad you finally figured it out, she said with barely contained enthusiasm. We've been worried about your safety for so long. We've already thought of everything, Crespin added. Found a great place where you'll be cared for by professionals. There's medical staff, 24-hour surveillance, everything you need. From her bag, Tabitha pulled a thick folder of paperwork. We've brought all the necessary papers, she said. To save time, we can get everything formalized today. I looked at the folder with feigned curiosity. What kind of paperwork is this? Nothing complicated, Crespin answered quickly. Just formalities. consent to a medical examination, an application for transfer to a specialized facility, and a power of attorney to manage your affairs while you adjust to the new place. He spoke calmly, but I could see the muscles in his face tense. Tabitha, meanwhile, was spreading out the papers on the coffee table, trying to look businesslike and organized. Can I read them first? I asked. I want to understand what I'm signing. Sure, Tabitha agreed, but there was a touch of irritation in her voice. It's all standard in there, though, the usual wording. I picked up the first document and began to read slowly, running my finger along the lines. It was an application for voluntary admission to a psychiatric hospital for evaluation for senile dementia. At the bottom was a space for my signature. The next document was a power of attorney for Crespin, giving him full authority to dispose of my property. And the third was a consent to sell the house in case I needed to pay for medical care. These are very serious documents, I said, setting the papers aside. What if I change my mind? Would it be possible to cancel? Crespin and Tabitha exchanged a quick glance. Of course, Mom, my son said. But why would you change your mind? You said yourself you can't live alone anymore. Yes, but I feigned hesitation. What's going to happen to the house? I mean, it's Dad's house. He loved it so much. The house will stay in the family, Tabitha hastily assured me. We won't sell it unless absolutely necessary. We'll just formalize it so we can make quick decisions in case of an emergency. It was a straight-up lie, and we all knew it. In the folder I'd found the day before was a completed sales contract with the buyer and the date of the transaction. And exactly which nursing home will I be going to? I continued to ask. To Sunny Hills, Crespin replied. It's a very nice place. The facilities there are wonderful, qualified staff. I knew it was a lie. Their plans included a cheap municipal nursing home in a neighboring town. Sunny Hills was an expensive private facility. They certainly weren't going to pay for me. Can we see the place first? I asked. Before you sign the papers. Crespin was starting to lose patience. Mom, you need an appointment there, medical certificates, and your condition could worsen at any moment. It's better to get everything formalized in advance. Doreen, Tabitha intervened. You realize we want what's best. We've spent so much time trying to find the right place. It's not worth putting things off. I felt the atmosphere in the room heat up. They clearly expected me to sign the paperwork without too many questions, and my hesitation irritated them. Okay, I said finally, but is it possible to call this nursing home? I want to talk to the administration. Why? Crespin asked sharply. I mean, we've already talked it over with them. I just want to hear from them myself. Get the details. Tabitha pulled a cell phone out of her bag. Here, you can call, she said, holding out the device to me. The number is written down in contacts. I took the phone and pretended to look for the right number. In reality, I was looking to buy time. The lawyer and detective were supposed to be writing everything down, but I needed to get Crespin and Tabitha to say more. Who were those doctors who gave opinions on my condition? I asked, putting the phone away. I want to talk to them. Crespin's face darkened. What other conclusions? What are you talking about? Well, you said the doctors are recommending special care for me, so there's some kind of medical documentation. Oh, that. Tabitha tried to look nonchalant. Yes, Dr. Harlow gave his opinion after his examination, and Dr. McIntosh noted some memory problems as well. Can we see those reports? Why? Crespin was clearly nervous. It'll only upset you. It's better to focus on the future. But I want to know exactly what's wrong with me, I insisted. What is my diagnosis? Tabitha and Crespin exchanged glances again. I could see they weren't expecting such detailed questioning. Their plan was for me to dutifully sign all the papers, thanking them for their concern. Initial signs of dementia, Tabitha finally said. It's nothing serious, just needs monitoring. And why don't I remember anything about this diagnosis myself? I continued my questioning. Usually, doctors explain their condition to the patient. You forgot, Crespin replied quickly. I mean, it's one of the symptoms. You've been forgetting a lot of things lately. Like what? Well, you forgot to pay the electric bill last month, and you left the front door open, and you've been going outside in your house slippers. It was all made up, but it sounded plausible. I realized they'd been preparing for this conversation for a long time, coming up with examples of my alleged inadequacy. Did the neighbors see me go out in my slippers? I asked. Yes, Tabitha answered confidently. Mrs. Palmer told us about it. It was another lie. Mrs. Palmer lived across the street, and we hardly ever spoke to each other. She certainly wouldn't discuss me with Crespin. How about we call Mrs. Palmer? I suggested. Have her tell me exactly what she saw. Crespin rose abruptly from the couch. Mom, that's enough. You're stalling for time. We came here to help you, and you're setting up some kind of interrogation. Doreen, Tabitha said softly, we understand you're scared. That's normal, but you need to make a decision. Every day of procrastination increases the risk. What risk? That something serious will happen to you, Crespin explained. That you'll fall or forget to turn off the gas, or you won't be able to call for help. He spoke more and more nervously, and I realized the moment was near. They needed my signatures today, and they were ready to apply the pressure. Okay, I said, holding out my hand for the paperwork. Where do I sign? Tabitha's face brightened. Right here, she said, pointing to the first document. And this is your pen? She pulled an expensive fountain pen out of her bag. I took it and leaned over the papers, pretending I was going to sign. Wait, I said, straightening up. What's going to happen to my stuff? With the furniture, with the pictures? We'll keep everything, Crespin assured me. We'll move the most expensive things to your new place. And the rest? Well, the rest will have to be sold or given away, he admitted reluctantly. There's not much room in the nursing home. I see. I leaned over the papers again, but stopped again. And who's going to decide what to keep and what to sell? Me, Crespin answered. I'll have power of attorney. So you'll be able to sell anything you want? Theoretically, yes, but it's not like I'm going to. Will you be able to sell the house too? Crespin hesitated. Only as a last resort. If you need money for your treatment. And who's going to determine that's an emergency? I will. His voice grew harsher. Mom, are you signing these papers or not? We can't wait all day. Tabitha was beginning to lose patience too. Doreen, you're the one who asked us to come. You yourself said you were ready to move. Why complicate things now? I'm not complicating things, I objected. I just want to understand what I'm agreeing to. You're agreeing to be taken care of, Crespin said sharply. To living a safe life, isn't that enough? I looked at both of them, my son and his wife. The masks of caring began to fall from their faces. Now I could see their true intentions. Greed, impatience, annoyance that I wasn't acting like a submissive victim. What if I changed my mind? I asked quietly. There was a tense silence. Crespin and Tabitha looked at me with undisguised shock. What did you say? Crespin said slowly. I said I changed my mind. I don't want to move anywhere. I want to stay in my house. Tabitha jumped up from the couch. You can't change your mind. You're the one who called, the one who asked to come over. I have the right to change my mind, I replied calmly. This is my home, my life. Crespin stepped closer to me. There was an expression in his eyes that I had never seen before, a cold determination. Mom, he said slowly, you can't make rational decisions anymore. You have dementia. You're not responsible for your actions. I don't have any dementia. I replied firmly, and I'm perfectly responsible for my actions. No, Tabitha objected. The doctors have confirmed the diagnosis. We have all the necessary paperwork. What documents? Show me those reports. They exchanged glances again. Tabitha dived into her bag and pulled out some papers. Here, she said, holding out the papers to me. Dr. Harlow's report. I took the paper and read it. It was a medical report stating marked signs of senile dementia, inability to live independently, and need for constant supervision. It's a forgery, I said, setting the document aside. What? Crespin went pale. I said it's a forgery. Dr. Harlow never gave me that diagnosis. You just don't remember, Tabitha began, but I interrupted her. I remember everything perfectly well, and I remember that you planned to steal my house and my money. Dead silence reigned. Crespin and Tabitha stood as if frozen, not knowing what to say. Mom, Crespin finally said in a hoarse voice, what are you talking about? What plans? About the plans you wrote down in your paperwork, I replied. About forged medical reports, about bribing doctors, about selling my house for half price. Tabitha turned sharply toward Crespin. There was genuine terror in her eyes. She knows, she whispered. How can she know? I know because I found your papers, I said, rising from my chair. All your correspondence, all your plans, all your calculations. Crespin took a step toward me. Where are those papers? In a safe place, along with the cake sample you brought yesterday. His face contorted. You, were you eavesdropping on us? No, I replied, but someone alerted me to your intentions. Who? Tabitha grabbed my arm. Who could have known? At that moment, footsteps were heard from the basement. Attorney Adams and Detective Cope were coming upstairs, followed by two uniformed police officers. Police, one of the officers announced. Don't touch anyone. Hands where we can see them. Crespin and Tabitha froze in shock, not realizing what was happening. Lawyer Adams walked over to me and touched my shoulder lightly. It's all right, Mrs. Claypool, he said. We've got it all written down. The silence that settled over the house after the police car with Crespin and Tabitha left was quite special. Not like the usual evening hours of quiet I'd grown accustomed to over the years of living alone. It was the silence of liberation, the silence of truth finally triumphing over lies. I sat in my chair by the window and looked out at the street, where the last rays of the October sun were burning out. Detective Cope had already picked up all the recording equipment, and Attorney Adams had left with a promise to contact me tomorrow to discuss the next legal steps. The documents Crespin and Tabitha had brought to sign were left lying on the coffee table as mute witnesses to their greed. It was strange to think that even this morning I'd been dreading this meeting, rehearsing every word, every intonation. And it turned out that they had exposed themselves. Greed and impatience made them show their true colors sooner than they had planned. As the police handcuffed them, Crespin tried to explain, to assure them that it was a misunderstanding, that he had acted in good faith. Tabitha remained silent, only once glaring at me with a look of such hatred that I shuddered. At that moment, I realized that I had never really known this woman who had been my son's wife for 12 years, and Crespin, my only child, the one I had carried under my heart, birthed in agony, nursed through childhood illnesses, taught to walk and talk. How could he plan to steal from me everything that was the meaning of my life? How could he look me in the eye and lie to me for months? I stood up and walked through the house, examining each room with new eyes. Here was the living room, where Harold and I had hosted guests, where Crespin had assembled constructors on the floor as a child. Here's the dining room where we had family dinner on Sundays. The kitchen where I cooked his favorite meals and baked cakes for his birthdays. Every corner of this house held memories of happy times when we were a real family. But now those memories are tinged with bitterness. It turns out that the last few years, when Crespin had pretended to care, had actually been preparation for a robbery. I went up to the bedroom and pulled that folder with their plans out of the stash. Rereading the documents, I realized how carefully everything had been thought out. They didn't just want to get rid of me. They planned to do it in such a way that I would be grateful for their care. Especially cynical were the calculations of profit from the sale of the house. They planned to buy a property in an upscale neighborhood with the money from the sale of my home and send me to a cheap municipal institution where old people live out their days in poverty and neglect. And that Caribbean cruise, they were going to celebrate their victory over a defenseless old woman by traveling on stolen money. $25,000 for 3 weeks of luxury vacations while I would sit in an overcrowded nursing home room. But what struck me most was the coldness of the calculation. There was not an ounce of doubt in their notes, not the slightest remorse. I was not a person to them, not a mother or grandmother, but just an obstacle to money. The phone rang, breaking my gloomy thoughts. An unfamiliar number popped up on the display. "Hello?" I answered cautiously. "Grandma, it's Ivory." The granddaughter's voice sounded quiet, frightened. "Can I come to you?" So she already knew about her parents' arrest. I wonder how she took it. After all, these were her mother and father, the people who had raised her for 17 years. "Sure, come over," I said. "Only how will you get there?" "By bus. I'm already on my way." Half an hour later, I heard the doorbell ring. Ivory stood on the doorstep with a small backpack over her shoulders. She looked pale and confused, her eyes red from crying. "Come in," I said softly. "Do you want tea?" She nodded and walked into the living room, sat on the edge of the couch, clenching her hands into fists. I noticed she avoided looking at the coffee table where those damned papers still lay. While I made tea, Ivory was silent. It wasn't until I set the cup in front of her that she finally spoke. "Grandma, I'm the one who sent you that message," she said faintly. "About the cake." I sat down next to her and took her hand in mine. "How did you find out about their plans?" "Overheard the conversation." Ivory began to cry. "They thought I was asleep while they sat in the kitchen discussing how much sleeping pills to add to the cake. They said they needed you to look sick when the doctor came." "Why didn't you tell me everything right away?" "I was afraid," the girl sobbed. "I mean, it's my parents. I didn't know what to do. I thought maybe they'd change their minds. Maybe things would work out." I put an arm around my granddaughter's shoulders. Poor kid, how she had agonized all these months, knowing her parents' plans but not daring to stop them. 17 years old was still too young to stand up to adults. "And how long did you know about their plans?" I asked. "A few months," Ivory replied. "They often talked about how you were too old to live alone. And then I saw Mom forging documents. She was sitting at the computer and changing dates on some papers. And you didn't say anything?" "I tried to give you a hint." Ivory looked up. "Remember when I said, 'Be careful'? I wanted to warn you, but I didn't know how." Of course I remembered that strange episode in the kitchen. At the time, I hadn't realized what she meant, but now it all fell into place. "What happens now?" my granddaughter asked. "What's going to happen to me?" It was a good question. Ivory is a minor. Her parents have been arrested. Who will take care of her? Do they have any other relatives? "Do your parents have brothers, sisters?" I asked. "Mom has a sister in California, but they don't communicate, and Dad doesn't have anyone." So the girl is effectively on her own. Sure, there would be child welfare agencies, foster homes, but she's 17 now, soon to be 18. You could try to get custody of her. "Do you want to stay with me?" I suggested, "while we sort out the situation?" Ivory nodded so vigorously that the tea in her cup sputtered. I really want to. I didn't know where to go. Then go upstairs and pick a room, I said. The house is big, there's plenty of room. When my granddaughter went upstairs, I was alone with my thoughts again. Life had taken an unexpected turn. In the morning, I was a lonely elderly woman in danger of losing her home and her freedom. In the evening, I was the guardian of a 17-year-old girl. But strangely, it didn't frighten me. On the contrary, Ivory's arrival gave meaning to my life. I had someone to take care of again, someone to pass on my experience and knowledge to. I stood up and gathered the papers from the table. Tomorrow I would have to give them to the lawyer as additional evidence. In the meantime, I'll burn them in the fireplace. Let these evidences of betrayal and greed disappear. The flames licked greedily at the paper, turning Crespin's and Tabitha's plans to ash. My last illusions of familial intimacy, of the blood ties that should bind parents and children, burned with them. But not all blood ties turned out to be false. Ivory took a risk, warning me of the danger. She chose truth when her parents chose lies. So there is still honesty and integrity in our family. There were quiet sounds coming from the upstairs bedroom as Ivory sorted through her backpack, getting settled into her new home. Tomorrow she'd have to go to their house to get her things before the police sealed the apartment. Her school, her paperwork, her future college tuition would have to be sorted out, and I'd have to learn to live with the truth about Crespin. Accept the fact that my son was capable of betrayal for money, that the man I loved most in the world saw me as nothing more than an obstacle to wealth. It's painful, but it's the truth, and I prefer the painful truth to sweet illusions. It's better to know who's who than to live in deception. The fire in the fireplace was burning out, turning the last pages into smoldering embers. I tossed in a few more logs to make it burn brighter. A lot of things had burned today. My illusions about family, my notions of maternal love, my trust in those closest to me. But from the ashes of old illusions, something new was born, an understanding of my own power, confidence that I could protect myself, and gratitude for the few people who hadn't betrayed me. The anonymous well-wisher who'd sent the warning, the lawyer Adams, Ivory's granddaughter. I went upstairs to check on Ivory. She had chosen the room that had once been Crespin's nursery. Standing at the window, she looked out at the night street. "What are you thinking about?" I asked, entering the room. "About what's going to happen next," she answered without turning around. "I never thought parents were capable of this." "I didn't think so either," I admitted. "But now we know the truth, and we can build a life based on honesty." Ivory turned to me. "Grandma, will you forgive them?" It was a difficult question. In the back of my mind, there was hope that someday, years from now, we could repair the relationship. But now, with the wound still fresh, forgiveness seemed impossible. "I don't know," I answered honestly. "Maybe someday, but not right now. Right now, I just want to live my life without fear or deception." "And will you forgive me?" Ivory asked quietly. "For keeping quiet for so long?" I walked over to her and hugged her. "You have nothing to repent of. You were a child in a difficult situation, and in the end, you made the right choice." We stood at the window, grandmother and granddaughter, two generations of the same family who stayed with each other after the collapse of all illusions. The stars shone outside the window, the same as they always had, but the world around us had changed forever. In the morning, a new life would begin. Without Crespin, without Tabitha, without the constant fear of betrayal. There will be difficulties, legal procedures, custody issues, adapting to a new reality. But there will also be freedom. Freedom to be herself, to make her own decisions, to manage her own life without regard for the greed of others. And there will be Ivory, A girl who took a risk for the truth, who chose her grandmother over her parents when she realized who was right and who was wrong. She has something Crespin didn't: a conscience. I turned out the light in my room and said goodnight to my granddaughter. In my bedroom, I lay in bed and closed my eyes. For the first time in many months, I fell asleep peacefully, without fear that tomorrow would bring new attempts to deprive me of my home and freedom. The house was mine. Life was mine. And I intended to live it honorably, not letting anyone steal my independence. At 72, I learned a lesson that few people learn at that age: that bloodlines do not guarantee loyalty, and that a true family is made up of people who choose love over gain.